somewhere along the line, and I'm not quite sure where and when it was, we made a decision that the impact that any company has on the environment has no cost. So you can blow stuff into the atmosphere for free. You can chop down trees to build your skyscraper. All of this does something to the environment, but we don't cost any of that in. And the consequence of that is every single thing you and I buy in the world is mispriced. It's much cheaper than, in fact, the cost of making it truly is.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Margaret Heffernan drives her editors crazy. She writes books about leadership and business, yes, but they're about so much more that it's hard to know where to put them on the shelf. She writes about how businesses perceive the world, often wrongly, and how cognition is distributed across healthy, thinking companies. She's passionate about releasing the talent that often lies unrecognized in companies simply because it's unconventional. And in all of her books, she looks past the obvious to something deeper. Margaret's been the CEO of 5 media companies across 2 continents. She's a global expert on business leadership, management, and innovation, an award-winning author and keynote speaker, and has 4 TED Talks that together have been listened to over 14 million times. In this episode, Margaret and I talk about her books Willful Blindness, The Bigger Prize, and Uncharted, the importance of growing whole and free people instead of obedient employees, the dangers of identifying star players, how every business decision has ethical considerations, what data can't tell you about your business, as well as how to manage in the face of an unknowable future, and much more. Okay, as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, my conversation with Margaret Heffernan. Welcome, Margaret Heffernan, to Work for Humans.
Hi, Dart. It's great to be with you.
I first became aware of you because you and I gave talks at about the same time at different conferences at the beginning of COVID. And I had thought that I had done a pretty good job, and then I heard your talk. And I actually wrote you at the time, but I think it was through LinkedIn or something like that. And I said, look, you just gave a talk. It was way better than mine. And specifically, mine was about how to take advantage of the challenges of COVID for businesses. But your talk was a lot more aspirational. Mine was still about coping, and yours was like, let's take advantage of this. This is a huge opportunity for us. And it also had this sort of moral feel to it. So there's a lot I want to talk to you about. And my very first question is, the books that you have written are so deep. They're about what we can know. They are about how we know it, how we cope with unknowing. They're about complex systems. Why are you writing about business?
Wonderful question. Well, it's interesting because in a way, I don't think I am writing about business. I get quite a lot of grief from my editors because they say, we're not quite sure where your books fit. Are they business books? Are they philosophy? Are they self-help books? Are they psychology? And the truth is, of course, they're all of those things and probably a few other things I haven't mentioned. I mean, what I try to write about really, if this doesn't sound too pretentious, is I just try to write about human life and work and the way that we create companies in which people work. They're a very big part of that. But I've always thought that the idea of a business book, which takes our working life and puts it in this separate solar system, is just a completely ridiculous construct because that's not how we experience life. If I've had real difficulty getting my kids to school in the morning, then that mother who's really wound up is the person who turns up at work that morning. And that mother's wound up state may persist for quite some time. At the same time, if I've just had a fabulous family breakfast and I go into work with the joys of spring in my mind, that's the productive person who turns up and starts doing good work. I think that many of the things, in fact, that go wrong in business do so because we think it's a special category. We build environments in which people have to be different people than they really are. And then we wonder why they go wrong. And I've always felt that we need to integrate these different parts of our lives, all these different identities. I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a sister, I'm a neighbor, I'm a friend, I'm a commentator, I'm a reader, I'm a musician, and that it's actually fragmenting these things that creates a lot of confusion and unhappiness in the first place.
How do businesses go wrong?
It is a huge question. And of course, that's the basic theme of my book, Willful Blindness, although it's by no means a comprehensive explanation of all the things that can and do go wrong in companies. I do think that one of the fundamental ways is that we treat them as special environments. We allow ways of thinking and living and forms of behavior that if we, or when we import those into the rest of our lives, look distinctly weird and usually bad. Workplaces tend to be very transactional. When we start treating our friends in that way, we get pretty swiftly rebuffed. So I think, ever since the Industrial Revolution, when we took work actually out of homes and put them in these special workplaces, and then we designed special kind of furniture for them and certain neighborhoods for them, and we built the walls around business very high. I think we introduced language and ways of thinking and treating each other that really lead us far astray from whom it is we are or want to be. And the way that a lot of fancy sociologists talk about this is they talk about values incongruence, which is, I think, a rather ugly but succinct way of talking about how we are different people in different places. And whereas we have strong values at home, often those values get eroded at work because we think our primary aim at work is to do a good job rather than to be a good person. And I think we get very confused about who am I as a good person in this strange place that prioritizes productivity and loyalty and obedience. I think companies go wrong because they're not quite sure where their boundaries are in people's minds. I think that power in itself, and I've written about this since my very first book, I think power is a very confusing concept. It's a very difficult thing to have. It's a very difficult thing to use well. And in fact, one reason, after having run 5 businesses, that I no longer do so is I really don't want to be in a situation where I have a lot of power over other people. I love the power that I can co-create with people to do things together that I couldn't do on my own. But I think having power over people is and ought to be a pretty intimidating state. I think the people who like it are really dangerous, and you probably want to give it to people who don't like it, but that isn't generally the way it works. I also think that in the last 50 years, economics have absolutely eaten our brains to the point that we start to measure everything and think that the value is in the numbers, whether it's measuring your 10,000 steps a day or measuring, the quantity of what kind of quality sleep you had today, how many calories you consumed today, what your bank balance is today, all this kind of stuff. We've applied the aesthetic and value system of industrial production to ourselves and to our society. And I think all of that has undermined a lot of ethical, intuitive, creative behavior.
One of the things I love about your books is that you hold leaders, I feel, to a very high moral standard. And it does have to do with power to some extent. There's like this connection between being weak-minded and being morally weak, or lacking the courage to let go of power. There's a question of, how do I get the whole organization to think together well and be a collective cognitive system? Talk about, if you could, the morality of leadership.
Well, it's really interesting because I remember reading one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, Blink, some of which I liked and some of which I didn't. But I kept thinking, oh, come on, what do you believe? It tried so hard to be not even to be objective. It tried so hard not to express an opinion. And I thought that was partly wanting to make sure it didn't offend anybody, which I thought was morally weak. But I also thought it meant it, on the one hand, made the evidence more powerful than really it is. as if there was an objective way through some of these value-laden decisions. But it also unconsciously colluded with this idea that organizations are like machines, and if you just had exactly the perfect calibration, everything would be okay. And I've always felt that organizations are not like machines. They are much more like organic systems in their complexity and their capacity for resilience, and that's a better way of thinking about it. Once you adopt that kind of organic metaphor as opposed to the mechanical metaphor, you can't get away from the ethical questions. And I think that there's far too little discussion in many of the companies I work with as to whether a decision is the right decision versus whether it will effectively hit our targets. And the whole language of targets and goals and KPIs and big, hairy, audacious goals and all that stuff suggests that this is a morally neutral universe. But if you're working with other people's money and time, which as an employer you are, and as somebody receiving your customers' money you are, and shareholders' money if you're a publicly traded company, the minute you're dealing with other people, you're dealing with ethics. That's it. You just don't have any choice. You're in that territory. You've crossed that line. And however this mechanical language may obscure it, every decision you're going to make has ethical consequences. And one of the things I've been thinking about most recently is the degree to which somewhere along the line, and I'm not quite sure where and when it was, we made a decision that the impact that any company has on the environment has no cost. So you can blow stuff into the atmosphere for free. You can drive cars that expel fumes for free. You can build the cars that do that for free. You can build buildings with concrete that exude CO2. You can chop down trees to build your skyscraper, and so on and so on and so forth. All of this does something to the environment. It's maybe good or bad, but we don't cost any of that in. We've decided, in effect, that companies can do to the environment what they want, and there is no cost. And the consequence of that is every single thing you and I buy in the world is mispriced. It's much cheaper than, in fact, the cost of making it truly is. And that's even if you have decent labor conditions. So I think the whole way that we've thought about business as something that has to obey rules, but where we don't have to have consciences about consequences, has been a little bit like being a 2-year-old, where you're not expected to have consciences. You're not expected to be able to think something through. So you get a free pass for a couple of years when you're a toddler. But we've really spent too long in toddlerdom. And now we're reaping the consequences of this because now we have to pay up.
It's interesting. There's two themes that you just mentioned that I think run again through all of your books. And one of them is that there's more flowing through companies than money.
Yes.
And that all we look at is the numbers in spreadsheets, but there's a lot more flowing through. But the second one is that if you look at any piece of a system, it can be a selfish piece, or it can be aware of the larger context, and it can be collaborative.
Yes.
One of your books, which is very much about, it's the bigger prize, which is very much about selfishness and winning, and how that doesn't work and doesn't actually optimize the larger system. And what you're talking about now is, okay, now you've got a whole company, but it's being selfish, and it's being myopic about its effects on the larger environment.
And I think this is why I don't shy away from the ethical aspect of the issues that I describe, because all ethics start with other people. Aristotle thought that ethics started with friendship because friendship was the first experience a person had of another person as an other for whom one had concern and or responsibility. And I think that there's a great deal in the way that we've thought about businesses and by extrapolation, the people working in businesses, that has tried to persuade us that if we just look after our own interests, that will, a la the invisible hand, look after larger interests. And sadly, I think we are discovering very much the hard way that it doesn't quite work as easily as that.
Yeah. The thing I'm curious about is whether simple-minded wins. And the reason I bring it up, is it likely that organizations that are simple-minded will win out over companies that are thinking more holistically? I mean, and I think that's one of the fears, which is that if I don't pay attention to the money, I'm going to not be able to compete effectively.
Well, I think that's true up to a point. If you don't look after the money, you may not be able to stay in business, at which point you definitely aren't competing. There's another thing to think about, and I encounter this in quite a lot of the businesses where I work with the CEOs or if I sit on their boards, which is somewhere along the line, we lost the idea of enough. I think it's Michael Sandel who talks about the degree to which our societies and our companies in particular have become insatiable, that we have been brought up with the belief that growth is always good, bigger is better, cheaper is better, faster is better. And sometimes it's true and sometimes it isn't. And I remember writing about a very successful female entrepreneur in the United States. This is in my second book. And she talked about how her business had grown and grown and grown. And she was a little dazzled and overwhelmed. And she was sitting on her patio one day and she looked over at a rosemary bush and she saw it had, had a huge growth spurt. So it was kind of leggy and ungainly and not very attractive. And it had lost all its proportion. And, so she got the clippers out and kind of reshaped it. And then she thought, that's what I need to do with my company. I need to let it just rest and catch up with itself and regain its proportion, because otherwise it's kind of out of control. And she said it was one of the hardest things she'd ever done, which was to explain that, yeah, I know we've been going gangbusters, but let's just pause and collect ourselves and catch our breath and make sure everything's good and solid before we go on to the next stage. And it's something I've seen a lot in companies. I think you've seen quite a lot of it after the lockdowns lifted and everybody kind of surged back into work. And then they realized that they were rather overwhelmed and exhausted, and that actually they couldn't just pick up where they'd left off because something really big and mysterious had happened to everybody and we weren't the same anymore. And I do think increasingly that really good leadership is cognizant of this, is not convinced that all growth is excellent, and is careful to monitor the health rather than the size of a business. So not just, are we making money? Are we making more money? Are we making money the right way or the best way? Are the people who are doing this in a good and fit state? Are the suppliers that we depend on, are they doing okay? Are the customers that we're serving, are they doing okay? Because if all of that ecosystem is healthy, then we can be pretty confident and we can probably, if we want to, grow. But if they're not, because we're all interdependent, we'd better stop and see which bit of this system needs some repair.
On the boards that you're on and the leaders who you consult with, is this message, does it land? I guess the question is, I'm sure it does sometimes.
Yeah.
But how often, I guess, is the question.
So I think it generally lands. I mean, to be fair, if it doesn't, they don't want me around or I don't want to be around, in the sense that I don't want to waste my time. If the way I'm trying to help isn't deemed helpful, then it's better to part company. I think, to be honest, what happens more often is I give courage to quiet voices, and I give people permission to ask themselves questions that perhaps they thought weren't on the agenda. So, I had a really interesting debate with a board member last week, which was about data and the importance of collecting data, which I completely, I can see the value of. And I was making the point that you just have to be careful, because you can be deluded into thinking that all the information you need is in the numbers, and it won't be. And the real problem is you're not quite sure what isn't being captured, but I promise you it isn't all in the numbers. And it's so interesting because when I was running tech companies, my lead investor had investments in about 40 businesses. And I remember asking him, gee, how do you keep up with all those? How do you know what's going on in them? And he said to me, well, I just look at the numbers. And he was, I have to say, as close to a genius mathematician as I've ever met. and a very, very brilliant guy, which was one reason I liked working with him. But I know there were things in his companies that he did not know about that could not be captured in numbers. And some of them mattered and some of them didn't. But the ones that mattered a lot. So I think when I bring value to a board, it's in being a little bit more discursive in the way that we think around what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I try to think about what are the issues or concerns we're missing? What are the voices that aren't being heard around the table? What is it the people around the table are trying to say that isn't being listened to, and why might that be? So in some ways, I'm probably spending a lot more of my time listening because I've sat on lots of boards where nobody ever did that. Where everybody was so eager to put in their 2 pennies worth that nobody listened. And I think somebody's got to. And I quite like doing that job.
I like hearing that. I'm about to go to 20% at my company, and that's going to give me 80% to listen, maybe 90% to listen. And I'm fascinated with the idea of what's it going to be like to sort of move around in the walls and be able to listen in.
I think also one thing that's really, really valuable in people that are working part-time is they're spending more time in the world. And one of the biggest problems I notice with boards is that they tend to be very introspective because those are the things that they can control and manage and which they hope that they understand. And the consequence is there isn't very much that happens in boardrooms or senior leadership teams that's informed by what's going on outside the business. But the business depends completely on that external context. So I think going to 20%, there's also a huge opportunity to bring into the discussions what's happening in the great outside world.
Yeah, I hope so. And it's not just in the market, but I think, for instance, in deep thinkers like yourself and being able to bring that in. You've run 5 companies, and they've been media companies, and you ran them essentially before the internet and after the internet.
Mm-hmm.
How did you do? And because this is a podcast about work, what was it like working there with you leading with some of these ideas?
Well, it's hard for me to know, right? I mean, I would say 2 things. A number of people who've worked for me, in different incarnations have told me I was the best boss they ever had. Now, maybe all their other bosses were even worse than I was, who knows? And a number of people who've worked for me have gone on to start and run their own very successful businesses. And I'm gigantically proud of them because clearly there was something that they saw that about running a business that they wanted to try. And I'd like to think that they learned something, even if what they learned from me was what not to do. I think what I was trying to do, and I'm the wrong person to know if I succeeded in this, I tried to treat everybody equally, not that as the same person, but as different people, all of whom had equal value as human beings. I was extremely honest or transparent, as they would say now, and sometimes chastised for being too honest, which was an alien concept to me. I did and do believe very much that businesses have to be partnerships. So, the suppliers or customers I thought were as important relationships as any others. And I also really liked what I was doing. And I felt that other people should be happy at work too. I was really lucky, and this was pure luck. Pretty much the first real boss I ever had was a very, very brilliant radio producer. And he had more ideas than he had time to turn into programs. So they'd be commissioned and then he'd have no time or resources to make them. So he would just say to me, take your pick. If you can make one of these damn things and get it off the list, that would be great. And I was never told when to turn up, what my hours were, or any of that kind of nonsense. I would pick a program, I'd make the program. I'm not sure anybody ever heard it before it went out. And we got along brilliantly. And he was such a creative individual and, technically such a genius. I learned a lot from him, but I learned it by doing it. And I had no idea that this wasn't everybody's experience of work. But I had huge freedom. I was trusted. If I made a program that really wasn't great, it wasn't the end of the universe as we know it. I wasn't especially managed, and I was phenomenally productive, as was he. And when I got, when I was promoted, that's how I treated people. That all seemed to work fine. When I worked in television, that's how I treated people. That all seemed to work fine. And so I'm kind of constantly amazed these days by these companies that try to tell people, you have to be in at this time, or you have to be in on these days, or, you have to arrive and leave at these times. I just basically always said to people, don't let your colleagues down. If they're dependent on you for a piece of work, you have to honor your promises and do the very best work you can. And if at any point you can improve it, you should improve it. And work where you want. Just don't be really difficult for other people and always honor your promises. And that's pretty much it. And it worked really well. I mean, even to the point that when I moved to the US and I had members of staff who were pregnant, and they'd say to me, well, what's the deal in terms of maternity leave or something like that? And I remember my CFO actually came to me. She's having her first child. This very complicated spreadsheet of how she was going to do 2 hours a week, on the first week, and 2.5 hours a week the second week or whatever. It's very complicated routine. And I said, look, Daphne, you've never had a baby before. We all hope everything goes fine, but you don't know how you're going to feel or the baby's okay. So here's the deal. You just figure it out and you come back to work when you want, as you want, and we'll just keep paying you. How's that? And that was the same for every other woman who had a baby in the company. And there was not a single person who ever let me down. There was nobody who just kind of took advantage of it. There was nobody who stayed away for 2 years on full pay or any of that kind of thing that people worry about. And I just treated people the way I wanted to be treated.
I want to ask a question about Uncharted, which is, I believe, your most recent book. Am I correct about that? That Uncharted is your most recent book?
Yeah.
It really seems like a child of the pandemic, but the truth is it was published right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was actually, I think it was 2020, right?
Correct.
So for people who haven't read it, it's a book about the uncertainty of the future. And in fact, how complex systems are necessarily unpredictable and necessarily emergent. And that people who try sort of this high modern approaches to predicting them just fail. And I have a question. It's a leadership question, which is the desire for certainty in the future. Is that related to fear? And I just feel like so many leaders are in a position where they're responsible for so much and accountable for so much. And there's so much uncertainty that they grasp at the certainty.
I think you're absolutely spot on. I think it's absolutely about fear. Because obviously, if we knew exactly what was going to happen, we think we'd know how to make good decisions. It would certainly, we think, be easier. But of course, that's only true if the certainty we had was pretty positive. If you think of the US and the UK fighting the Second World War, the uncertainty of defeat was what kept us going. Certain defeat would not have made our decision-making, might have made our decision-making easier, but it wouldn't have made our lives any easier. So I think our desire for certainty probably carries with it a sort of implicit hope that the certainty is positive. Which is really just nothing more than saying, we just hope everything turns out all right. And I have a huge amount of sympathy for people who feel, as I frequently do, I wish I could just pick up the history book of the next 10 years and peek at the end to see it all worked out okay. We'd all like to do that. We're living in very dangerous, frightening times. But I think that as long as we lust for certainty or yearn for certainty, we waste the opportunity to explore where are we really and what are our options. So my observation is that many business leaders spend more time reading people who are making forecasts and predictions, which they absolutely can't guarantee, than they devote to exploring what are the possible outcomes and how prepared are we for those. And that, I think, is a more productive exercise. If I don't know, for example, whether the war in Ukraine is going to go on for 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, and all of those options are plausible, then I do far better to think through in each of those scenarios the consequences for me and how I can put myself in a stronger position than to reach for the pundit that tells me what I want to believe. Because if I reach for the pundit, then I'm just flying blind. If I can go through those scenarios and think through the consequences, then I'm in a prepared state, which is the best I can be when it comes to the future. And it's no different than thinking about, I don't know how long I'm going to live, so I don't know how I should spend my money, but I can think, okay, if I'm going to live another 10 years, this is what I would need, and also what I'd like to do in that time. If I'm going to live another 20 years, then what's the scenario? If I'm going to live another 30 years, that's the scenario. And there will be things in each of those scenarios that are common, in which case those are things I really can nail down. So the uncertainty is now reduced. And there are other things which I'll have to decide, well, if I never get around to doing that, is that okay? If it's not, well, then I better do it now. And other things I think, well, I don't know, it may well be I never get to Japan. That's okay. I can live with that. I mean, I quite like to go to Japan. I've always been interested in Japan. But if I, on my deathbed, would that be a gigantic regret? I think I could live with it. So it just allows you to make those kinds of decisions in a more detailed way, which makes the future less amorphously terrifying and helps me to understand the things I really care about. I have now, as far as I'm able, ensured that that will be all right.
I think one of the real wisdoms in Uncharted is to cast a wide net to all stakeholders, to gather the broadest perspective of the possible futures and what they mean to all the stakeholders. Great story in there about how Mexico did scenario planning. And some of their scenarios are terrifying. Like, what if we become a failed state led by gangs? But ultimately, it meant that they were not going to be as surprised. They were not so afraid that they weren't willing to look at the possible downsides of the future. I found that really inspirational.
I found it very inspirational. And I think that one of the other things that came out of that exercise was that they recognized in their collaboration with people radically different from themselves that there was a possibility for social cohesion that they had not glimpsed before. For example, when the terrorist and the archbishop both recognized that they really loved their country and that they cared hugely for some of the worst off in the country, that was a kind of miraculous moment. And whereas before they had defined themselves as opponents, now they found themselves on the same side. And daring to have those conversations is what allowed them to discover that common ground. There's a wonderful academic in California, whose name I think is David Fishkin, who has done some of these very big gatherings of people from radically different walks of life in the form of citizens' assemblies. And these two have a very similar feature, which is that people come together who imagine themselves to be opponents and come away not feeling that they're identical at all, but having respect for each other's point of view because they can see where it's coming from, whether it's informed by life experiences or life obligations. The differences between them no longer feel irrational or vicious. They have a story behind them which can be understood and cared about. So these kinds of discussions, dialogues, convenings have been shown to be very powerful decision-making methods, partly because if you've been part of them, you understand a decision which you may not like very much because you understand who it's serving, you understand why they're important, and you appreciate that sometimes you have to sacrifice a bit for the better good. And understanding the process by which the decision was reached makes it very much easier to tolerate. And that, it seemed to me, was, the fantastic insight that derived, for example, through the gigantic debate that took place in Ireland over the abortion referendum, which was the debate was so pervasive across the country and so detailed, and the evidence on which it was based was so trusted and authoritative that even those who disagreed with the referendum in the end felt the process had been fair, and they could live with it. And they might hope one day that the views would change, but they nevertheless felt that the decision-making process and the outcome was legitimate. And that legitimacy, it seems to me, is really the thing to strive for, because that's when we all really articulate our shared citizenship and want to contribute to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, it struck me as incredibly courageous in all of those instances to open it up to public scrutiny. In all of those cases, it was very broad net and open to public scrutiny. And I would like to see companies do some of their internal design that way. It's one of the things I thought when I was reading that, which is I would love to see us, for instance, design performance management, which is a very high modernist sort of approach to things. I'd like to see us open that up and design it together and come up with something that we can all agree with.
I completely agree with that, because I think most performance management systems are hated by most of the people who operate within them. They're incredibly time consuming, and they address something that's really important. Like, how do I know I'm doing a good job? I would like to know if I'm doing a good job, and I'd like to know how to improve. But they do so poorly. And I don't think that means you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I feel pretty confident that when you open it up to the workforce to design, and I know companies that have done that, you come up with something that people respect and they appreciate it because they get feedback, which is useful and can help them do a better job, and also shows how and when and where they're appreciated. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think doing it on one side and then kind of throwing it over to the other side to live with, it's just like a really bad conversation where only one person gets to do the talking.
And you speak it very persuasively, I thought, about how companies that essentially reward superstars don't get the complexity of how companies really work. And that there's an opportunity to, for instance, not assume that there's only one kind of superstar. That essentially, that there's an enormous variety of kinds of superstars.
I think that's a really brilliant insight, because you're absolutely right. There are many, many different kinds of superstars. And I can think of one of my companies where I had just a phenomenal software engineer. I can also think of someone else in the same company whose superstar quality, if you like, was completely different, in the sense that she was really great at spotting where fires were about to break out and just moving in and sorting out whatever the problem was. And she was multidisciplinary. She had a lot of skills, but you couldn't say she had one, Olympic level skill. But honestly, you take her out of the company and the company doesn't work as well. And, it's been very fashionable to think that these kind of so-called middle managers are a waste of space. And, whenever the market turns down, you chuck them all out. But in my experience, many of these very multifaceted people, they are the mortar that holds the whole thing together. They tend not to blow their trumpet. They tend to be very alert to who's good at what, where's good stuff happening, where's not such good stuff happening. And they're really vital to maintaining the health of an organization, but they don't stand out in a crowd.
Yeah, this week, I think it was probably reading your work, actually, I decided to write an article called Leading from the Sewer. And it is about middle management. And it's about the tips and tricks of the trade and how powerful that position is, how important that position is, and how to make that work.
Yeah. And a big part of making it work is by recognizing the value of that kind of work.
That's right. And then characterizing what that value is. It's very much about connection. It's very much about, I have one article that I wrote for Jim Carrot-Burtwell, which is about inverting the org chart and how the team should be seen as the top of the tree where the leaves are growing, and that management should be the trunk of the tree. It's a much more organic, much less command and control way of looking at it. So what job do you hire your work to do for you?
I think what my work does for me is, if I think of my work as primarily as writing, which I do, it helps me think. My personal belief is that, at least for me, writing is the best way of thinking ever invented. And so all of my books have been prompted by something I watched and did not understand, but which I felt was important. And I thought I probably could understand it if I dug into it deeply enough. So, for example, a bigger prize was prompted by my feeling that competition just didn't work the way that economists said it did. So I wanted to find out, how does it work in practice as opposed to theory? Willful blindness was prompted by, how come we ignore all this stuff and what are the consequences? The stuff which afterwards we realized was in full sight. And why has it gone on for centuries? And I think Uncharted, I know Uncharted was prompted by things I heard people say that over time I just kept thinking, this is really weird. The way people think about the future is really weird. Some of it's downright crazy and some of it's really bad. So what's that about? So I think that's what my work does for me, which is it gives me a way to figure out something that's really bothering me. What it costs me, it cost me quite a lot of agony and discomfort because I'm pretty rigorous and I have little voices in my head saying, really? Are you sure? How do you know? Is that right? What do other people think? What about this? What about that? So I have a pretty big argument going on in my head when I'm writing, but I do kind of love the argument too. I love the obsession that takes over my life when I'm working on a book. It costs me in the sense that there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that were I to become a business, which most people in my position do, I would earn a lot more money. I'm very happy not to do that because I do think I'm only going to live once. I have run businesses. I don't want to run another business. And the stuff I do is so personal to me. I don't want to confuse why I'm doing it. So I want to kind of keep it simple. And keeping it simple makes it less profitable. But it still affords a very wonderful life, not least because I'm doing work I love with people I really respect. And where people can contact me is most easily through my website. The contact thing always comes through to my assistant, who always comes through to me. And that's just www.mheffernan.com.
Great. Thank you very much for coming on. I loved your books. And I will tell you, they are beautifully and deeply thought and written. I really admire them greatly. So thank you very much for writing them, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for saying that. At one point, it's quite funny. I realized I spent a lot more time and effort thinking about how I wrote them than many people. And I asked myself the question, so if you could write more books faster and they weren't as well written, is that what you want to do? Because there are plenty of business books out there that sell very well that are not very well written. And I thought about it and I thought, I don't care. I don't want to write books that aren't as well written as I'm able to write them. And if that, coming back to your wonderful question, if that costs me, well, then that's just a cost I'm prepared to bear, because there are a lot of these books out there that I just can't stand to read.
I've said this about a lot of the books on my shelves here, which is that we keep the beautiful books in the house and we keep the business books, most of them in the garage here where I am, because we'd like to be surrounded by beautiful books. Occasionally they do it. I think we're going to keep yours in the main house. So thanks.
I'm flattered. Thank you so much. And thanks for a really thoughtful conversation.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.